70 million. That's how many Galaxy S4 devices Samsung sold over the course of its lifetime. That makes this phone not only one of Samsung's best-selling devices, but also the #1 best-selling Android phone of all time. Now, depending on who you're asking, some report the S4 sold more than 80 million units, possibly tying for the top spot with the previous year's Galaxy S3. But because exact sales numbers of both phones aren't really out there anywhere, we just have to guess which device outsold the other, because someone's got to claim that top spot. I could be wrong, but in my mind, it's the Galaxy S4 all the way. I remember seeing these things everywhere, and even well after they were discontinued, the S4 just continued to hang around. It became possibly one of the most iconic smartphones of all time. Unfortunately, while my US Cellular S4 does technically support LTE networks, it wouldn't take any of my SIM cards, and likely wouldn't even work too well on modern carriers. That's partially why at this point, they're a dime a dozen pre-owned on eBay, where an S4 in good physical condition can be bought for less than $50 US. But how in 2013 did this phone achieve such success that it became the best-selling Android phone, still unbeaten? Well, let's take a closer look and find out. First, let's go back to the S3 and talk about that phone's similar success, because as mentioned earlier, the S3's sales are close, if not tied with the S4. Looking back at the S3 from our perspective in 2025, it's kind of difficult to see the appeal of such a tiny, seemingly limited device. But back in 2012, the S3 had plenty going for it. Smartphones were taking over the world, and Samsung was already a recognized name, not only in the smartphone market, but also just phones in general. So many people already had Samsung phones, and now they were getting into the smartphone game with some pretty strong competitors. But with the S3, Samsung went so minimalistic and unoffensive that it stood out from the crowd because it didn't stand out from the crowd. Most Android phones at the time went overboard with their designs and didn't really appeal to many average consumers who wanted a phone that didn't try too hard to look smartphone-y. Add to that the fact that this phone was made available on almost every carrier imaginable, which made the S3 pretty much a guaranteed success. But Samsung wasn't going to stop there. With that much momentum behind them, all they had to do in 2013 was take the highly successful S3, level it up in almost every way, and that's how we got the Galaxy S4. Now, I don't want to make it seem like the S4 lived in the shadow of the S3, because that just wouldn't be true. The S4 was genuinely better in almost every way possible. Just looking at them side by side, the S4 just looks so much more serious, with the S3 looking comparatively much cheaper. The S4 also has a beautiful 5-inch Full HD Super AMOLED display that looks fantastic in almost any lighting conditions. It wasn't the brightest display out there, but it easily puts the S3 to shame and makes video playback, gaming, or whatever you're doing look awesome. All this top-of-the-line stuff was backed by a similarly top-of-the-line Qualcomm Snapdragon 600 processor and 2 gigs of RAM. In 2013, these specs made the S4 a multitasking and mobile gaming powerhouse, fully capable of keeping up with even the most demanding tasks. Of course, using this phone in 2025, you can feel the slowness compared to what we have now, but I was kind of surprised by how well this thing still handles multitasking. That is probably due in part to the fact that my S4 is updated to Android 5 Lollipop. When this phone was released back in 2013, it was on Android 4.2 Jelly Bean, and from the reviews I've seen about the phone at the time, it seems like there were a few bugs and glitches that need to be ironed out, which does seem like that did happen. With the update to Lollipop, Samsung's Android Skin TouchWiz also got a much needed facelift, as this was one of the major criticisms reviewers had with the S4, and for good reason. The one thing no one ever criticized about the S4 was its camera. For the S2 and S3, Samsung had used similar 8-megapixel cameras that did the job but didn't stand out from the crowd. With the S4, however, Samsung took their camera game to the next level, with a 13-megapixel camera that many reviewers at the time called the best camera on a smartphone. Here in 2025, we're going to need some context to back up that claim, and yeah, looking at photos from the S3 and S4 side by side, it's easy to see what all the hype was about. Photos from the S4 are brighter, sharper, and have more accurate color tones when compared to pretty much any phone camera at the time. But even when not being compared to previous models, these are some pretty decent photos. Of course, this camera does best in ideal lighting conditions, but sometimes handled challenging lighting surprisingly well. I didn't find the night mode on the S4 particularly helpful, but hey, there are plenty of other photo modes to choose from here if you're looking for something more interesting. Most of these are pretty gimmicky. Maybe you'd try them a couple times and think they're cool and then never use them again. One exception to that, or at least in my opinion, is Rich Tone HDR mode. High Dynamic Range, or HDR, is a standard feature in all modern smartphones, but back in 2013 this was more of an optional feature that often had a dedicated mode because you didn't always want it turned on. This feature essentially makes sure photos have even amounts of exposure so the brighter areas aren't too bright and darker areas aren't too dark. The Galaxy S4's HDR mode is pretty good, but just like all early HDR enabled camera phones, the results are often unpredictable, with the S4 usually erring on the less dramatic side but often producing some surprisingly high contrast punchy photos. Video recording was also a highlight of the S4's camera, being capable of shooting at full HD resolution and creating some pretty good looking videos. Again, I was quite impressed by some of the footage I got out of this camera. Not too bad for a 12-year-old smartphone. In case you think I forgot to talk about all the S4's possibly just gimmick features, no worries, I haven't forgotten them, I just saved the best for last. For better or worse, the one thing Samsung phones have never been known for is software minimalism. I already briefly touched on the abundance of camera tricks, but that's barely scratching the surface of just how many little tricks this phone has. Let's start with all of the S software, because there for a while Samsung was going all in with S everything, and the S4 is packed with it. S-Voice was Samsung's attempt to compete with the on-the-rise voice assistants like Siri and Google Assistant. Unfortunately, I can't test it since the S-Voice servers no longer exist, but from what I can tell, the overall opinion of it was that it didn't really work that well. No big surprises there. S-Translator was a basic translation app that let you translate typed or spoken text from one language to another. Again, the servers this service relied on no longer exist, but it looks like a pretty useful little app. S-Memo is a pretty standard note-taking app with no real standout features beyond maybe the clip art. It is pretty visually appealing though, and kind of reminds me of the Q-Memo app from LG. Last but not least is S-Fit, a fitness app that can keep track of everything from steps to weight. This app can even keep track of your calorie intake by logging what food you eat. And if you had a Samsung wearable device, this app could connect to it and do sleep tracking as well. This was definitely one of the most comprehensive health and fitness tracking apps ever built into a phone. But of course, this isn't such a novel thing in the modern world of smartphones. If we're going to talk about things that you don't find on modern smartphones, take a look at the top of the S4 and you'll find a couple of them. Of course, there's a headphone jack because those were the good old days of wired headphones, but arguably more interesting is this little thing beside it. That's right, the Galaxy S4 has an IR blaster. And in fact, the S4 was the first Galaxy S series device with an IR blaster, meaning you can use the phone as a universal remote for anything with an IR receiver, which is almost all TVs and similar appliances. Some phones from other brands like LG did this too, so it might not be unique to the S4, but it's still a cool feature nonetheless. Speaking of cool features, the S4 also has a bunch of unique gesture controls. Yes, they're more party tricks than anything, but check this out. With air gestures, you can control the phone by waving or moving your hand in front of the device. This allows you to skip or rewind music tracks or scroll your photo gallery all without even touching the phone. I can't really think of a real life situation where I'd ever need to do this, but you've got to admit it's pretty cool. Another arguably pointless gesture is Air View, which allows you to simply point or hover your finger over something on the screen to get a preview of it. It actually works really well, but again, I really wonder how many people found this feature genuinely useful. Not to mention, you probably don't want to be seen in public waving at your phone like this because, unless they know what you're doing, it's going to look pretty weird. Something that I actually do think is useful are the palm motion gestures. When enabled, this allows you to take a screenshot by swiping the side of your hand across the display. You can also pause music or mute incoming calls and alarms simply by covering the display of the phone. If modern phones had these features, I'd probably find it pretty handy. When you take all these fun tricks, mix it with great performance, a great camera, and fit it all into this attractive package, you get a phone that could easily become one of the best selling devices of all time. The S4 wasn't perfect, of course. It was often judged for its questionable plastic build quality, and as fun as all the extra software features can be, it could easily overwhelm new users. But in the end, the S4 was the best selling Android phone in existence, and it is yet to be replaced. I can pretty much guarantee that most of you watching this video have either owned or know someone who owned one of these back in the day, so please share your S4 stories and experience in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for watching this video. If you would like to see more like this, consider hitting that subscribe button so you don't miss out. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.